I just want to welcome everybody. My name is Keith Courtwright. I am the Director of Pupil Personnel Services in Parsippany, and I want to thank you all for joining us for our presentation of how sensory processing might be impacting all of our child's behavior and social emotional well-being. And I'm happy to welcome Michelle Parkins with us. I'm going to give a brief little overview of Michelle. She is an occupational therapist who specializes in working with children and families impacted by differences in sensory processing and challenges in social emotional development at her private practice, Great Kids Place. As senior faculty of the Sensory Therapies and Treatment Institute, she is a key opinion leader in assessment, treatment, and education related to sensory processing and integration, development, and disorders. Michelle teaches and assists in the design of the certification courses in sensory processing and integration, educating therapists worldwide. She is assisting with the standardization and development of the latest assessment for sensory processing disorder, soon to become the gold standard for identification of SPD and supporting research. Michelle has co-authored a chapter in the 3rd edition of Sensory Integration Theory and Practice, the textbook for which sensory evaluation and treatment alongside world-renowned pioneers in the field, Lucy Jane Miller, PhD OTR, and Sarah Schoen. Is that how you pronounce it? Okay. PhD OTR. Michelle is a clinical consultant for Flag House, a leader in providing sensory therapy equipment, where she assists in the design and development of the equipment and toys used for sensory-based therapy, quite a bit used in our district, I should say. Michelle advocates for all children and families impacted by sensory processing and integration disorder, to help them and others to understand the impact of this disorder on social emotional functioning, emotional regulation, developing and maintaining relationships, and social skills. She has embarked on a journey to learn more to support children and families by engaging in certification in infant and early childhood mental health at Montclair State University. She is DIR certified and is faculty of Profectum Foundation, where she educates therapists all over the world on social emotional development and the DIR model. Michelle Parkins is passionate about working with families and other therapists, and she continues to do so as a clinician and educator. Michelle is also a mother of 2 children with sensory processing differences. She uses her real-life experiences to help her clients better understand the impact of SPD on family dynamics and relationships and the day-to-day demands of life with sensory processing differences. Thank you, Michelle, for joining us tonight. I turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm like tired hearing all that stuff, but that's what I try. I like to put that up front because it's really all of those things come into the presentation that you're going to hear tonight. First and foremost, I'd say, as the mom of 2 kids with special needs, social emotional as well as sensory processing, certainly keeps me grounded in my practice as well as my recommendations and understanding the day-to-day of this sounds good when you say this is the best way to do it, but how do I do this as a mom, in the middle of everything else that we have going on in the world, particularly now. So I'm going to try to keep it real. Tonight, we're going to go over just a basic outline of what is sensory processing. What does it mean? The different layers of it. There's, many people think about this as just sensitivities, just sensitive to touch, sensitive to sound, which is a small piece of really what it is. So we'll go over that tonight and discuss, how do we know? How do we know if you're seeing certain behaviors, certain challenges, if you have certain questions about your child's development, how do you know if it's related to sensory processing? So that's what we hope to answer tonight. And then the second part will be, what do you do about it, right? So just some strategies. So if you've come to this one and you leave it thinking, okay, I think this is a part of the equation for my child, we'll do a little bit of ideas today so that we don't kind of leave you hanging here. But then we'll come back and meet and go over some strategies. Alrighty, let's go here. So we already went over that. Okay, so let's start at the basics. So when I say sensory systems, what do we mean? So they're the ones that we learned about in kindergarten, right? Our sight, our sound, our touch, our taste, our smell. And then there's There's three really, but two that we'll talk to tonight that we don't learn about, the vestibular and proprioceptive systems. And I'll go into these a little bit further. But essentially, these systems take information from the environment and from our body, bring it up into our brain so that we can figure things out, right? So we can figure out, what do we do? How do we interact with the world? And how do we fit? How do we fit in this world around us? So I like us to think about this for a second, that, there's this so-called real world, right? This perception of things around us that for the most part, there's a range of a normal, right? We all sort of somewhat perceive it to be the same way. We see the light about the same way. We hear sounds about the same way. We feel the seat that we're sitting in about the same way. However, there's some difference in all of us. And, there in the sensory processing world right now, there is a shift from this term of sensory processing disorder into sensory processing differences, because the more we can all understand how sensory processing impacts us in general, because it does, every single one of us, every single day, then we can be a healthier, better person in our world. So just to take a simple, dive into the fact that we all have differences. It's the differences that make us not be able to do what we need to do every day that puts us into that disorder range. So as I'm talking tonight, you might say something like, "Oh, that's me," right? That's my spouse. I have a friend like that, that kind of thing. I definitely identify with several areas of these sensory processing challenges. Some of my older kids that I work with will say, like, "Do you get it because you do it too," kind of thing. And I'm like, yes, that's exactly right. But, for the most part, I can function throughout the day. I've just continued to learn a little bit more and be able to use that information to figure out what I need to be functional day to day. So let's talk a little bit about the senses that you probably have not heard of, and that we definitely don't learn about. So this is our vestibular sense. So our vestibular sense is in our inner ear. Doesn't really have anything to do with hearing at all. It just sort of is housed in there. And it's our main balance receptor. So when we start to lose balance, the reason it's in our inner ear is that we generally can feel our head moving in space before anything else, right? So, and that's because it lives like right in that space in our ear. So it gives us our head's position in relation to the ground, right? So that we don't fall over. It also is the foundation for all of our movement through space. So you can think of it sort of like your internal GPS system, where as we're moving through space, this system is constantly pinging us to say, this is where you are in relation to everything around you. This is where you are in relation to everything around you. For academic purposes, it's the super bottom tier foundation to all spatial understanding. So it's really common for kids who have challenges in vestibular processing to have challenges with spatial orientation on the paper, right? When you think about math problems needing to be lined up, writing needing to fit in a specific space. Even as simple as put your name at the top of the paper. If this system isn't properly telling you where up is, then translating that to a piece of paper is going to have to be overthought, right? It's really going to have to be a cognitive effort as opposed to an automatic effort. The proprioceptive sense is in all of our muscles and joints. So every single time we do any movement in our body, little tiny receptors throughout our muscles and joints send information to our brain about our position of our body. So vestibular system is more position in space. Proprioceptive system is body position. Functionally, really hard to differentiate the two of these because they work so closely hand in hand. And that's where we get that integration part, the sensory integration. So what do we use this for? We use this for pretty much everything we do every day. Anything that you do with your body that you're not watching, you're using this sense, which is a large part of our day, right? We can go through our morning routine without thinking about what we're doing, right? We can sometimes we can even write a note. Like I can have a conversation, I could do this, I might think about something I have to do that after this. I can actually write that note without watching because the proprioceptive sense is guiding my actions, right? So the proprioceptors and the vestibular system receptor are constantly giving us feedback about our accuracy. So when we have an idea and we go to do it, these two systems are guiding us to that process and helping us to make adjustments that we need along the way. When we talk about sensory integration, this is the third system that we think a lot about. We obviously integrate all of our senses, and we'll talk about a little bit about that. I'm going to actually use a boogie boarding example in a little bit to hopefully bring us some summer thoughts in this crazy snow craziness we've had. So the touch sense is, definitely what we think about a lot when we think about sensory processing, where kids don't like to touch certain things or don't like to wear certain things. But it's also important to think of the touch system as a super organizing space when we process it accurately for where our boundaries are. Where is the boundary of me, right? Because it maps our entire body, literally maps our entire body. So every action we make, even the air that brushes on our skin when we're making an action, gives a big check into our body about how everything is going as we're moving. So our visual sense, I like to add here, obviously we're pretty familiar with this one, but I like to call it the checker, because the vestibular sense is the one that will help us to make sense of things when these body senses are not doing their job. So a really good example of this is if you're walking down the street, typically we don't have to watch, right? We don't have to watch our feet. Unfortunately, we're usually texting now, right? So we're not paying any attention at all to our body, to our bottom half of our body. So we're walking along and we trip. And the very first thing we do is look down, right? So our visual system says, wait a second, that's not what was supposed to happen. Let me figure out what's going on. I say this here because I want to kind of plant the seed of what we want to use our visual system for is not checking our body, right? We want to use it for social interaction. We want to use it for paying attention in the classroom. We want to use it for reading, for writing. We want to use our visual sense for much higher level things than worrying about what our body's doing. We want the body systems to be able to do that. If these body systems are not doing their job, though, the very first thing the visual sense is going to do is take care of your body. Right, so it goes into the safety protection mode and will automatically be the checker, which takes our attention away from everything else, right, that we should be visually attending to. Okay, so I kind of touched a little bit on why it's important, but I just want to show you a couple visuals here to understand this. So developmentally, some of the things that we might look at when we consider development, whether it's a pediatrician, an educator, a parent, is something like actions, right? Can these milestones that we check, right, both academically and motor, can we do this? Can we do this? Can we do this? These are things that we can see, right? We can say yes or no because we see them happening. Before we can see everything on this other side here with the motor coordination piece, we have to process these senses. So the very first thing we do is register, notice, okay, I heard something, I see something, I felt something move within my body. That's really just an orientation. It's okay, got it. Then we move into discrimination, which is, okay, tell me more about this body, right? What was it? Where did it come from? How long did I feel it? How intense was it, right? All of these little details. So when we consider this for movement, from our body systems, from those proprioceptive and vestibular and tactile systems, it also tells us what we need to do, right? So from a body perspective, how much force do we need to use? How long do we need to move? At what intensity? At what pace and what timing, right? So all of these things that we don't have to think about as we're moving through life the automaticity of them come from these sensory systems being aligned and integrating in the right way. When we see things like the things we're going to talk about tonight with posture and motor control, we want to wonder about what's happening in these sensory systems to support them. Another way to look at this is the sensory systems are at the very bottom here of our what's needed to do the things up at the top. So the things up at the top, routine, roles, communication, social engagement, academic, having fun, joy in life, having good relationships, doing things you're supposed to in your routine and your roles. Those are the higher things that we want to see our kids be able to do. Those are the things that at my practice we get calls about, right? Emotion regulation, social engagement, engagement with peers, relationships within the family, not being able to do daily habits, daily routines as far as self-care. And from our perspective, we need to understand the very bottom here. What's happening in these sensory systems that can support our body awareness, that can support our motor control and our ideas, to understand our emotions and everything else in order to do that. So I just want to be clear that I'm not saying that sensory processing is the answer to everything. I don't believe that. But I do know for a fact that it's part of it, right? If there are challenges, it should be a part that's checked out. Okay, so let's go into what some of these differences could look like. So I start with the one that most people think about, which is sensory over-responsive. Okay, so thinking about that first stage, that registration, right? Noticing that something happened. We think that everybody somewhat has this normal range, right? And I use the example typically of, normally I would be in the room with all of you, and somebody walks into the door behind us. And, a typical response is that we might stop and we might turn around, right? We would expect that orientation to understand what's happening. Somebody who's sensory over-responsive will respond more than you would expect to a sensation, right? So that person might go, right, and startle just from the door opening when the majority of people did not. Okay, so very common, what happens with the sensory over-responsivity is the fight or flight response, that startle response. These are the ones we think when we see the kids covering their eyes or covering their ears or rubbing their skin in discomfort, that would be some examples of this over-responsivity. Okay, so here are some more examples for you. I don't put this on here intentionally to read from it, but I know that you guys get the handouts, so I like to put a lot of words on here so that you have them. But essentially, we have discomfort in several areas of self-care. Picky eating, picky clothing, not wanting to get messy, not liking touch of their loved ones, right? Not liking to be kissed, not liking to be hugged. Unfortunately, our intuition, usually as parents, when our child is upset, is to do the rub, right? Like the comforting rub. For a child who's over-responsive, that's not comforting at all. They actually are perceiving pretty typical daily sounds, touch, taste, smells, and movements as noxious, as something that is so aversive that they go into a fight or flight response, right? It's a primal response of, could be hitting, could be kicking, could be literally running away, could be yelling at you, right? So if you feel like you've had an experience where you wonder, like, I'm just doing blank, right? Would be something that as a parent you would say, I'm just trying to put your clothes on. I just want you to eat this. I just turned the vacuum on, right? I just want you to walk up these stairs, right? Where it's like, you're not really sure why it's a big deal. That's usually a daily life experience of something that's over responsive, right? Where they're responding more than you would expect. And it's really confusing as to why they would even be uncomfortable in that situation. Okay. So I'll talk about these other parts later. Okay, so our sensory under-responders are actually the total opposite, right? They respond less than we would expect to a sensory experience. So if we use the example of the door opening, right? So maybe there are a few people who are over-responsive and they startle. The majority of the people will turn and look, and then there'll still be others who don't even notice it. Okay, so that the group that doesn't notice it could be said to be under-responsive. So they can also be known to be as inattentive, a little bit slower, right? So these are our kids we're constantly telling to hurry up, or they could be in their own worlds. They're just missing the cues that are being presented around them. In a classroom, I usually say this is a child who is one step behind everybody else, right? Where everybody else transitioned to something else and they're like, oh, right? And they kind of hurry up and try to catch up, but they're just a little bit slower behind everybody else. So these individuals, these children they respond less than you would expect to things like getting hurt, temperatures, dirt on their body, the need to use the bathroom, right? Where they might have bathroom accidents beyond the expected age, or they know they have to go to the bathroom, but it's always last minute, right? So somebody who's under responsive needs more information to their body to process at a level that everybody else is. So if you use the example of going to the bathroom, they don't actually feel that they have to go to the bathroom until they have to go to the bathroom, right? So it's that intense level of input that they need to know that they need to go. They also will miss their name or miss directions, right? Need things repeated to them all the time. These are also the kids who are always like disheveled, right? The clothes are twisted, something's on the wrong way. They don't notice that they need to make these changes because they just don't feel it on their body. They also are bumping into things, bumping into people, bumping into objects. Often this is a example. The parents will say that they have bruises and they have no idea where they got them, right? Like might come home from the day and they'll say, where did you get that bruise on your arm? And what bruise? You know, they just don't feel that input at a level that we would expect. Okay, from a sensory discrimination standpoint, actually, let me rewind a little bit. So I want to talk a little bit here about under-responsivity in those body systems, in the vestibular and proprioceptive system. So the proprioceptive system is very much that bumping into and not being able to respond to a direction in the way that matches what you would expect, right? So you might give them a direction, multi-step direction, and they're a couple steps behind. From a vestibular standpoint, remembering balance. So very often these kids are the ones that are falling out of their chairs, right? Well, the teachers in the last 5 years or so have reported a significant increase in kids falling out of their chairs. And that's a whole other talk about the importance of movement to develop postural control and stability, but they just don't register it. So they start to fall, but that vestibular system doesn't pick it up in time to make the adjustment, and they actually fall over. Okay, so that's our registration. So we've got an over or under or just right? So we pick it up either too much, we register too much than we would expect, or not enough, too little, or somewhere right in the right range. Next, we discriminate it. So we've got the input, and now we're understanding the duration, the frequency, the timing, the intensity, and the spatial orientation. I want to skip here really quick just to explain that. So if you can remember when you were boogie boarding, I actually love this with my kids, and I always tell them that it's going to be really weird when they don't do it anymore, because I'm going to want to still do it and they're not going to want to do it. So it's sort of like I feel super fortunate for my job that I get to play every day with these kids, and I feel this way about boogie boarding with my own kids. So if you can picture yourself in the water and you're holding the boogie board and you're waiting to go, right? You're ready to go onto the wave. This is a great example of integration as well as discrimination. So you feel the waves, right? You can feel the slight pull and the slight push as you're standing in the waves. So this is a little bit of that feeling in your proprioceptive system where your muscles and joints are being moved just a little bit back and forth. You can feel on your skin in the touch system, the sand may be coming out from under your feet, the waves coming out and back on your skin, right? So you're starting to understand at what intensity is this wave coming, right? Because I don't want to jump if it's not going to be a good one. At what duration, right? How long do I feel this coming? So if I feel a big pull back, then if you've boogie boarded before, you know that there's a big wave coming, but you have to be able to feel that small detail to understand that that's what's going to happen next. So then you can also hear it, right? You can hear waves being far or close, and that will help you to try to time when to get on. So this is before you even do anything, right? These are all these different discrimination acts that are happening. Then you decide based on all of that feedback that you're going to jump, right? You're going to go on top of your board and it's going to be a good wave. As you're on the board, your vestibular system is your primary sense that's taking over because you're moving through space now, okay? So as you're moving through space, that vestibular system is telling you how fast you're moving, for how long you've been moving, right? And at what intensity, right? Is it super strong, or is it, are we starting to slow down? So we start to see this duration and pace change, because you don't want to land on the sand, right? You want to bail off that and try to go into the water on time. So you need to understand that spatial orientation as you're moving. At the same time, you need that vestibular system and your proprioceptive system to tell you, is your body still on the board, right? So the feedback from your touch system of the board being against you, as well as your muscles squeezing it and how hard you need to sustain that pressure and that force in order to stay on while you're moving through space. So little did we know our sensory systems were doing all of this while we were having fun on the boogie board, right? So that is what we're thinking about when we think about discrimination, is all these fine details that help us to be successful with something like this. And, granted, we don't do this every day. Some of us might not even do it every year. But there are hundreds of activities that happen on a weekly basis that the same thing needs to happen. So if we're having trouble in these areas, what it looks like is very often clumsiness, right? We can do things, but the coordination of which we do them is not on par, right? It just doesn't quite match. There's difficulty using utensils, writing implements. There's difficulties with using the right amount of force, so it could be too much or too little. There's difficulties with catching, throwing, kicking a ball, fasteners. And then also from a touch perspective and a visual perspective, finding something, right? So when you reach inside your drawer or your bag and you try to find something, that's a discrimination act where you're trying to actually feel the shape of something to determine that you need to use it. Now, in academics, each time we pick something up to hold, right? So if we pick up our pen or a pencil or a glue stick or whatever, that initial touch experience on our hand is the foundation for all of our grasp, right? So we immediately learn from our touch system what we need to do next. And then as we squeeze it, the proprioceptive system takes over in the muscles, okay? But it's all of these little details that I just explained for boogie boarding equally happen when we grab a pencil, figure out the touch, figure out how hard we have to squeeze it, and figure out how much we need to move it. Same thing as with the boogie board with a pencil and a piece of paper. Okay, so these guys typically just don't do it much efficiently, right? Like they're just a little bit insufficient. So usually on some sort of test or milestone or check with the pediatrician, like they'll check off, like they can do motor milestones, but they're just not able to do them with ease. Okay, so this leads us to what we see, our sensory-based motor development. So the first thing that we want to do developmentally as an infant is develop that postural stability and control. So just being able to maintain a stable base of support. So, we think about this as like sitting upright and not slouching, right? That's one way to think about it. But the other part is that stability supports all of our mobility. So if we can keep a stable upright position, we have all the freedom we need in our upper extremities to write, to throw, to catch, to hug, to push, to pull. All of these actions that we need to do with just our arms needs to come from this stable base of support. Similarly to our legs, right? If we want to kick something, or if we want to run, walk, control our start and stop of that action, that all comes from a stable base of support in your core. The vestibular and proprioceptive system are a huge contributor to core stability. So what does this look like if we've got weakness in posture, right? So definitely the floppier kids, right? Leaning on the desk like this, always hunched over, sort of like, just feel like they're hanging on their body, hanging on their bones is what it looks like. Their skeletons kind of holding up their body. Like they have difficulty using two hands together. So anything that specifically, really much so, anything that requires two hands together, because what will happen, especially with younger kids with postural stability difficulties, even older kids, the main job of their body is safety, right? They don't want to fall over on their head because their brain's in there, right? So the first thing our body's going to do is keep us upright. So we're going to prop. We're going to prop on one hand. We're going to prop on two hands. So it might be propped on one hand and using the other and then we switch this way, right? So rather than bringing two hands together to do a task. So academics could be something like cutting, right? Holding the piece of paper and cutting, opening containers, tying shoes, anything like that. And lots of daily skills that we do, getting dressed, doing fasteners, all of that requires two hands working together. Balance, difficulty balancing, difficulty sitting up. The other piece too is endurance. So we see kids that just tire very quickly, just get tired, and they start off strong and then fade as the activity continues. Another area here is moving the eyes separate from the head, which we need for reading, which we need for social interaction. When we don't see this, we see this, right? Where the eyes go, the body goes. It's sort of one big unit moving together. So we sometimes think about the fine motor piece that's related to the core stability, but we don't always think about our eyes being a fine motor action as well. And without that stable core, our eyes they're not stabilized, right? They're not stable and secure in order to move independently to do the academic work that we need to do. Sensory-based motor, again, our next one here is praxis, motor planning, dyspraxia. These are all terms that are used. So praxis is motor planning, the ability to motor plan. Dyspraxia is difficulty with developing a motor plan. And this has so many different areas that this could be a whole talk in and of itself as well. But the long and short of it is the process here is to either have an idea or being given a direction, developing that plan, right? So this is like a cognitive motor task, because you don't really see the first part. We don't always see them developing a plan. Then we see the execution of the plan, which comes in a lot of what we just talked about. How do they keep an upright position? What kind of coordination do they use with both sides of their body? Is it clumsy? Is it graded? What does the action look like? And the super big one here that we see that usually is the biggest red flag for motor planning difficulty is adaptation. Making a change when something doesn't go as expected, right? So I have an idea, I try to do it, it doesn't quite work out. This will be a meltdown. This will be emotion regulation difficulty if we don't kick into adaptation. So adaptation could be cognitive, could be problem solving cognitively, where we're referring to past experiences or we're talking ourselves through a task. But for the most part, our adaptation of plans should be automatic for us, because those sensory systems constantly give us feedback as we're doing the task. So when we don't see changes in the task when they're needed, right? And that this would look like if you're watching your child do something and you go, oh, you kind of know it's not going to work out, but you don't see the change happening. Or you go to make that recommendation and they're very emotionally charged by the fact that you've tried to change the way they're doing things. Okay, a little bit more details here. Difficulty following multiple step directions and learning new things. This also comes into difficulty with things like riding a bike, pumping a swing, doing sports, multi-step crafts, getting dressed, eating, using utensils. So you'll hear some of this in the discrimination piece, because these two are so tightly interweaved. The sensory ability to do sensory discrimination work as well as motor planning are married pretty closely together. Our play looks very repetitive. When we have motor planning difficulties, we play the way we play, right? I have this toy and this is how I play with it. I am playing with a peer, but I want to play this way, right? It's my way or nobody else's way. And that's because making the plan is hard. So if I have a plan to do something and it doesn't go my way, then I need to make a whole new plan, and that's hard. Okay, so what about sensory seeking? So sensory seeking is a term that will sometimes get you to an OT, which is great. Hopefully the occupational therapist has had additional sensory processing training. So I should mention here that we do not all have sensory processing training. We have one class in school for sensory processing. So you do have to go on and do all of the extra certification work in order to truly diagnose and treat sensory processing challenges. There are here and there courses that you can take to learn a little bit about a little bit. But, and I say this from experience because for years at the beginning of my career, I just took these little courses and thought I knew what I was talking about. And then I did the certification courses and I thought, wow, I only knew a little bit of what I was talking about. So it's really important if sensory seeking is a term that comes to mind for you when you're thinking about your child, this is a behavior that we can observe. It is not a diagnosis. It is not part of the normal sensory processing process for development, I guess. So what we want to know is why. Okay, so we can constantly, so sensory seeking means, right, that we need more, it looks like we need more input, looks like we need to move, looks like we need to touch, looks like we need to bump and smell, and seems like you're looking for input all the time. So I don't remember if I put this here, sorry. So no. So essentially what this does for a trained sensory OT is says, okay, let's ask some more questions. So it could be that you need more input, but that usually looks like under-responsivity, right? So if you're under-responsive, you need more input to register. Sometimes kids figure that out. If you're over-responsive, you can be very fidgety and anxious, right? And that fidgeting looks like the need for movement, right? Or pacing. How many of you pace when you're anxious about something, right? It looks like you need to move, but actually you're anxious about something. So it could be that you're over-responding to something. Postural stability. If we don't have core stability, it's actually easier to be in motion than it is to be still. It takes more muscles to be in a stable upright position, seated or standing, than it does to be moving. So a lot of our kids who have postural difficulties are in motion a lot. So it looks like they need movement, but they actually need stability. And then lastly, from a motor planning perspective, if we don't know how to adapt our plans or we don't know how to readily make plans, then we might do something for a little bit and then either we finished our plan and I don't know any other way to do this, so I'm just going to move on, or we get to a point in that activity where we can't problem solve and then we move on to the next thing because it's like, okay, whatever, I don't know how to do this, I'm just going to go do something else. So that movement from one thing to the next could look like you need movement, could look like you need to touch things, when really you just need a plan. So don't land on sensory seeking. Ask more questions, and you can ask the same questions. You can go back to this PowerPoint and start asking yourself the questions that we just went over. Okay, so what does this look like from a social emotional perspective? So our over responders are generally very shy. Okay, they're overwhelmed by busy things. They detect the sensations easier than others. They're super sensitive to the sensations, so they're hesitant to join an activity because they're not quite sure what it's going to be like. So if we have an over-responsive response in any sensory system, our safety feels challenged. So it could be a touch sensitivity, but you could be worried about going on the playground, which you're confused about at first. But then when you think about how many potential bumping intos and touch experiences could happen on the playground, then you might see where the hesitance comes from. Younger and even sometimes our older kids have difficulty separating from their caregiver because typically as parents, even if we don't know why, we know that our kids need a little bit more security and protection, and we just provide that for them. And then these kids also tend to cry more. Our under-responders, I actually changed this because I like the word daydreamer better, but I will tell you lazy is the term I hear a lot. With the precursor of, I hate to say this, but my kid is lazy, right? Or unmotivated. Daydreamer is a big one that I hear from educators, actually, that the kids are daydreaming in their classroom. So what we want to know here is so we see that they look unmotivated. We see they prefer to lay around as opposed to getting up and getting input. We see the slowness in interacting. We see the slowness in responding. We see them a couple steps behind, right? Which could look like they're doing that on purpose. But we want to wonder, right? Are they just not registering enough to do? Our discrimination guys usually get termed like they're just always confused, right? You look at these kids and say, why would they choose that, right? Like you see them doing an action and you look the way they feel, right? You look confused at them and they feel confused about why it's not working. So they're engaging in a way that is mismatched, and you're looking at them going like, why would you do this? So they choose unusual things that don't quite fit the problem that they're trying to solve or the task that they're trying to do, or they move in a way that doesn't quite match what they're trying to do. From an emotional perspective, these kids also don't really understand the gray area. So these are very black and white thinkers, very catastrophic feelers, right? Where everything's either great or terrible. Our posture kids are very needy, right? So thinking about the fact that they have low endurance, difficulty coordinating two sides of their body, difficulty keeping their body upright, they need help all the time. They need help for longer than you think. They don't feel like they're strong enough to do things. They give up very easily. They also give up very easily on non-physical tasks. So their body experience is, I'm not going to be able to do this. So even when a difficult task comes their way, even if it's academic or chores or anything around the house, then their perception is that they're just going to give up. And they generally can't sustain play with their peers. So they might start out strong and then they start to get behind. And our kids with dyspraxia or motor planning difficulties tend to look very scattered. I think about this in adult terms as the days that you start lots of projects but never finish any of them, and how dysregulating that feels, right? Where you started one thing and then you went to another thing and then you went to another thing, but nothing actually got completed. That's the feeling that we have from a social emotional perspective, these guys. Their stories also jump around. There's not really a clear, logical beginning, middle, and an end, which also plays out in their writing, right? If they're getting in the grades where they need to make a story or a clear, logical flow of their writing, we see challenges there as well. So they might get stuck in the details and lose the big picture, or they might go right to the big picture and forget all the details. Our dyspraxia kids have very significant challenges with handwriting very commonly as well. So as I alluded to before, these guys can also tend to be a little bossy. So our bossy kids they usually fall into two categories: dyspraxia or motor planning difficulties, and sensory overresponsivity. So from a sensory overresponsivity standpoint, I have to control anything I can in my environment because I'm not sure what it's going to feel like and if I'm going to feel safe with the experience. From a dyspraxia standpoint, I need things to go the way that I want them to go. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to plan and organize my actions. So they typically are coined like the directors of play or the directors of the house, right? They want you to do things in very specific ways all the time. So whether it's get the colored bowl that they want, or so-and-so needs to put me to bed, or I need my blanket this way, like these very specific demands that are quite exhausting to a parent, to be honest. And then our hyperactive kids, these are typically our sensory seekers, and these are typically our ones we want to ask more questions about. So these are our guys that are always on the go, difficulty calming down, can't stop fidgeting, and like bull in a china shop is usually what we think. So these could be our sensory seekers, and they could also be the ones that we need to know more about. Okay. How are we? We're good. Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm going to go through really quickly. These are the main areas of concern that we typically hear a lot about at Great Kids Place: hyperactivity, attention, anxiety, emotion regulation, social skills, and defiance. So again, sensory, understanding this as a possible piece of these challenges, not to say that sensory processing differences always cause these challenges, but my wonder for you tonight is to wonder if these sensory processing differences that we just talked about could be part of these challenges that you're having. So for attention, again, tons of words on here. Sorry about that, but you have it. So that you know the flow, the top, it goes in the flow of the presentation. So the top is over-responsive, then under-responsive, then posture, or then discrimination, then posture, and praxis. So if we're having difficulty with attention, and we're wondering if there's a sensory difference, right? if we're thinking about over responsivity, we can say, are they overwhelmed by the sensations and they're focusing on the sensations in the environment so much so that they can't attend to the material that you're presenting, right? So they're not paying attention to what you want them to pay attention to because they're paying attention to what sensations they could be processing. From an under responsivity standpoint, are they even registering it, right? So are we requesting that they do something, but they're not getting enough input from their body and the environment in order to be successful to do it? Are they overusing their visual system, like I talked about at the beginning, to guide their own actions so they can't pay attention to you? Are they concentrating on their posture, staying upright for so long and so hard that they can't pay attention to you, right? I've actually had old, like fifth, sixth graders tell me that this is the case for them. They'll say one of my kids that I treated, and when he was leaving, we had all these questions and answers like interview. And he told me that, when I was little, I remember if I had to pay attention to the teacher, I would fall out of my chair. And he talked about this, how he had to pay attention to himself being upright. So then from a posture perspective as well, are they able to orient their body to pay attention from that core? And lastly, are they confused about how to do it, right? So if we give them a task, we think they're not paying attention because they're not doing it, but are they maybe not having difficulty with the motor planning to support it? We already talked about this, so I'm going to skip that. So anxiety, what could be happening from a sensory perspective? As we've talked about with over-responsivity, are they concerned about what sensation they might be experiencing, right? So they're anxious. Our posture kids can also be pretty anxious. They're worried that they don't have enough strength to do it, right? So they start to worry that they can't do tasks that are being given to them. They also can have some unresolved fears. So we consistently see kids with posture weaknesses and just muscle weakness being afraid of things for longer. And we see some anxiety around motor planning, that they're worried that they're not going to be able to do what's being asked of them. They're not going to know how. When we think about emotion regulation, we talk about this term sensory residue, which means that if we all have this cup, and I know most of the world uses cup filler as a good thing. We actually think about it as a bad thing, as being overflowing. Okay, so if you've got a sensory processing challenge, we all have this cup of coping, right? We can all only cope with so much in a day. If there's any of these sensory processing challenges, some of that cup is already full because we already are working harder than we need to or should be to overcome these differences before we start anything. Okay, over responsive, we're always worried about what sensations are going to be around us. If we are under responsive and we don't register information from our body, we may not be registering our emotional state either. So that causes a lot of confusion. We could be trying so hard to not be overwhelmed by the world, to move our body the way that we're supposed to, that there's so much effort going into that we're tired and fatigued, right? And we just can't handle anything else. We can be confused and frustrated and worried when we're trying to plan our actions. We can be feeling very embarrassed about the fact that we can't move our body the way that we know we're supposed to. And we're just exhausted from using all of these compensatory strategies. So our kids with sensory processing differences generally are very aware of the expectations that they are supposed to be able to do. So they are also aware that they are not able to meet those expectations, and that's just very emotionally challenging. Defiance. This is one of my favorites because there's so many different underlying challenges for this. So if I'm being asked to do something and it has a sensory aspect that I'm over responsive to, I'm not going to do it because I'm scared of that sensory aspect, right? So I might appear defiant. However, I'm so overwhelmed by the sensation of it that I just can't bring myself to do it. I could also look like I'm defiant if I don't have enough information to do it. So if I'm not registering input from the environment or my body to orient and do what you're asking me to do, I'm not going to do it. So it may look like I'm just not looking at you or paying attention. From a posture perspective, right, that we're remembering these are our weaker kids. Their perception is that I need to try too much and it's just not worth it. Okay, like that task you're asking me to do requires so much effort. I don't even want to try it. And then from a motor planning perspective, they could just be confused, right? I'm not sure how to do the task that you're telling me to do. And unfortunately, it's not very common for our kids to speak up and say that, right? They may not even know yet that they don't know how to do it. So there's a lot of often the initial response is no, or I can't. No, or I can't, I don't know. Those three things are really common to hear. From a social skills perspective, I think we've mentioned a lot of these when I talked about the social emotional. So I think I already went over those. So that's just a different way for you to have that. So what can we do about it? Again, we'll talk a lot about this in the second session. But for now, if you've already identified some of those, I was saying to Keith, like, I hate to just leave it with nothing, like no ideas. But first and foremost, watch them, right? Our kids always come up with strategies on their own. They may not be functional strategies, but they're strategies. They may not get them to do what we're asking them to do, but they're getting them to a point of coping. So what are they doing on their own? What are they doing to increase their own attention? What are they doing to calm themselves when they're feeling overwhelmed? What helps them shift their attention and their focus? What helps them be successful? So if you've identified with any of the areas that I just mentioned, when one of those tasks are happening and it's successful, watch and see what they're doing in order to be successful. That gives us a lot of information about how we can support. Co-regulation, right? Being a co-regulator is meeting our children where they are and trying to bring them to where we want them to be. And it's really hard. So if they are overexcited and they are high, we need to be lower. If they're low, we need to be bigger. Okay. This is not always where we go intuitively. I know for me as a parent, like I'll tell people at my office what to do, and then I come home and I'm unable to execute it. So it's just a good reminder for all of us to say, okay, when we're anxious, when they're excited, when they're got a lot of energy, when we've got to figure this stuff out, we can't meet them at that high spot. We need to be a little bit lower. Another thing to look for is there a particular sense that your child uses to help regulate themselves? Do they fidget a lot? Do they touch things a lot? What do they go to when they're the most organized person they can be? So we do have a pretty in-depth website. Our blog has tons of activity ideas, further explanations for any of these areas and things that you can try. Our Facebook page is also pretty active with strategies. I will say that during lockdowns last spring, every day we posted something and explained what sensory areas it worked on. So certainly scroll back on the Facebook page to about this time last year, and there's tons of ideas on there. I can't really not give pictures of the space that I'm so grateful to have. So this is Great Kids Place. We play all day in our rooms that look like a lot of fun, and incorporate all these sensory processing needs into them. And I put this here for our next one because a lot of our strategies are very highly play-based. And then you guys have this in your handouts, but just here's contact information. And Sensational Kids is a book by my mentor, Lucy Jane Miller. That is another great spot to check out if any of this has ring true for you.